That is, it is not the case that the constrained executives are less coherent. In fact, those countries in which chief executives face multiple institutions of accountability, of constraint, there we find the more coherent policy measures. So in the Czech Republic, unlike the Hungarian we have a prime minister who is really truly chancellorial, who doesn't face fragmented parliament, who has a clear, whether it was the nationalists or the socialists in these two periods, the two different governments, they have a clear majority in the parliament. They are free to pursue their policies in an unconstrained way. What we find is that they have free rein to lurch from crisis to crisis. Now, is it the case that the Czech Republic has more coherent policies because Václav Klaus is a cynical politician who is able to disregard his avowed ideology in order to pursue a policy? Well, he is such a cynical politician, but that's not the reason why his policies are more coherent. His policies are more coherent because in the first period in which he is developing the active anti-bankruptcy policy, in the periods in which he is recognizing the network properties of liabilities and of assets, he's constrained by a federal constitutional structure in which he has to get his legislation passed not only one parliament, not only two parliaments, the Czech and the Slovak Republic, but passed three parliaments. It's a tricameral parliamentary situation in which the welfare, labor, and other social ministries are not held by his own party. He's in a coalition government, which is a very fragile coalition, in which he needs to appeal to his social democratic allies in the first moment to help him get through his policy measures. And these measures check and pragmatize him. Because in order to be successful in reform politics, the reform politician must have a vision. It is absolutely essential that the politician have a vision for which political support for individual policies can be linked to that long-term vision. But it's also extremely important that the vision not be held by somebody who is a visionary. That the politician must be doubly bound. Bound by a program, a set of accounts, a narrative, a systematic program that reaches and changes the chains of association that are made in the society, and also bound by a set of institutions which keep him or her from making disastrous mistakes. And we call these institutions those of extended accountability. They extend accountability not simply vertically, which is the accountability of elections, but horizontally. They make state institutions accountable to each other. And in that way, they make it less possible that precipitous mistakes are made. They extend accountability in time. Instead of the simple episodic accountability of elections, they may make accountability a continual process. And by a very curious paradox, they actually extend the time horizons of both politicians and the public. It's a kind of Zeno's paradox of politics, that instead of the longer the periods between episodes of responsibility, when they are shortened, right, made really short, where the public knows that the central authorities are accountable then at every moment, what it does is it forces politicians to take into their accounts, to take into account the long-term social and political consequences of their economic policies. And when they do so, it allows the public to give credit to politicians to take the long. And so extended accountability extends accountability horizontally, in time, and in scope. The Czech Republic is one where not only political institutions within the state, but political actors outside of the state, strong trade unions, strong associations in civil society, are also engaged in bargaining and negotiation and agreement with the government. And so the conclusion that we draw from this controlled comparison within our East European cases is that the neo-Hobbesians are wrong. Accountability and authority are not in trade-off. Extended accountability can actually extend authority to carry out sustainable reforms. Finally, if we think about the neoliberals as calling for the liberation of the market, and the neo-statists as calling for the liberation of the state, the view that I've adopted here is one that looks at institutions that deliberate, meaning that in a double sense, that deliberate, that bring in public forums diverse actors with interdependent assets, not only those of enterprises, but those of not only shareholders and stakeholders, but also non-shareholding stakeholders, that bring them together in deliberative forums. Another meaning of deliberate, that instead of finding freedom in isolation or freedom in obeying the imperative orders of a hierarchical state, these institutions deliberate. They are the binding ties that make possible binding agreements, and therefore make it more possible that sustainable reforms will take place in these periods of difficult uncertainty. Thank you.
Que apesar do avançar da hora, eu gostaria de ter algum diálogo com vocês, então, por favor, se quiser fazer uma observação, uma questão.
Yes, Carlos. Is that? Ma'am? Oh, yes, please. We're coming. We're passing here.
I'd like to ask you, Professor Stark, that this new consensus that the necessity of accountable device is the correct mechanism to enforce one efficient reform. And I'm so happy to listen to this kind of empirical research that can prove this kind of outcome. But I would like to hear more what kind of accountable device can allow this kind of efficient outcome. And also, what kind of mechanism of punishment and reward the good outcome and the bad outcome? Because the notion of accountability brings the notion of punishment of bad outcomes and reward the good outcome. Then I'd like to hear your comment.
Your question is an extremely important one, and you're perfectly justified to be very skeptical of this extremely cryptic presentation of the argument. So my answer is going to start, though, first with the sort of notion of efficiency. That's a very important part of the question. Because already the way I'm thinking about efficiency may be different, perhaps not from yours, but from the standard ways that political economists and all kinds of different perspectives are writing about this. Because I think about efficiency, or let me put it the other way. The standard way of thinking about efficient change in these societies is to make them, to bring about adaptation in the quickest and most efficient way possible. That is, these changes will be efficient to the extent that they make the economies of Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, adapt to the world market. And adaptation is the goal. And it's the kind of criteria that we would use for efficiency. If you haven't adapted, you didn't do it. Or if you do it in a very clumsy way, you do so less than efficiently. But in my view, that view is actually short-sighted. because it runs into the problem that adaptation might actually impede adaptability. Let's think about that for a moment. In fact, I'll make the argument even stronger. I'll argue that to the extent that an economy purely adapts to the external conditions of the world market, to that extent it will face difficulty in adaptation in the next moment. It's an interesting thing to think about, right? Perfect adaptation. That is, we put all our economic resources into the most efficient here. Think about a monoculture, an ecology in which all of the sort of biological resources go into the form that's most perfectly adapted to some big niche in that economy, and that's it. No more other forms, no other species. This argument that I'm making says, oh, that's very, very interesting. Because actually what socialism wasn't just that kind of intent. It's a very systematic analysis of the world economy at the time. It says, what's the most efficient form for competing for development? And it was the large state-owned enterprise. Well, what we're going to do, if that's the best way to develop, then let's put all of our economic resources in one organizational form. And what happened was a sacrifice of organizational diversity, which meant that the available, let's think about a species, the available diversity of organizational routines that the economy could draw on in the next period, when there was change out there in the environment, were limited. And so the economy has greater difficulty in adapting. Now, so already my notion about efficiency is going to move from static to dynamic. And I'll actually have to think about some notion of adaptive efficiency. So in that one, in that schema, institutional friction that blocks the smooth transition to a market economy actually might be preserving important aspects of organizational diversity, which will make possible further adaptability in the next way. Or let me think about it another way. Let's assume for a moment that we can all agree on what the most efficient form was for the transition period. Okay? My argument would be that the society would then face the new problem down the road, that form would not be the most efficient form for the new period after the transition, because the society would have changed in the process and the global environment around it, the economic and environment around it would have changed. So already, my notion of efficiency is different. Okay? And my criteria for how the society would better be able to reach those efficient conditions would be different. So I've already biased the case in favor of my kind of hierarchical view. But to turn to the other part of your question, what are the kind of precise mechanisms of accountability that I have in mind? The paper and the chapter of the book that this is drawn from owes a big debt to the work of Guillermo O'Donnell on what he calls horizontal accountability, in contrast to delegative democracy. And there are other standard things that are out there from the Federalist Papers on, that intrastate checks and balances make it less likely that reformers will adopt really crazy, wild policies. But the other one that we are calling for is this broader, extended accountability would include those of trade unions, which involved in tripartite, not necessarily corporatist, because the East European tripartite organizations look sometimes very corporatist and sometimes not so corporatist, are ways in which the state becomes accountable to actors out there in the society. Now, one of the things I wasn't able to say here, which you may have already jumped a couple of steps ahead of me, is in fact, the argument that we want to make about constraint is not just linear. There probably comes a point where too many different principles of accountability and too many constraints sort of create a more difficult situation. So it could be that we have a kind of bell-bending curve. But that's in the paper, and we have to read it and put it in our minutes. We have one more question, or everybody will go? Well, if not, then I look forward to your questions in the next several days, as you have an opportunity to see me here at these meetings.